Hello everyone and welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you all here today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Aytug Sasmaz. Aytug is a PhD candidate at Harvard University in political science. He's been in Tunis for 6 months and he's leaving tonight, which is a bit sad, but we're celebrating like being witness of a hard work, like real hard work during 6 months. And lots of traveling, lots of going around Tunisia, and it was impressive, and I'm proud, I can say right now. So Aytug is currently working on his dissertation project on challenges of party building in the Mediterranean Middle East, particularly in Tunisia, Turkey, and Morocco. He's involved in research projects on the determinants of primary health care quality in Lebanon, decentralization process and institutional design of local governance in Tunisia, and municipalization of rural governance in Turkey. He holds a degree in political science from Bogazici University and LSE and Brown University. And before his doctoral training, he worked as an education policy analyst at the Education Reform Initiative, a think tank in Turkey, where he conducted several research projects in collaboration with the Turkish Ministry of National Education, UNICEF, and the Turkish Foundation of Education Volunteers. He's today presenting the very first results of a survey he carried with other researchers working with him. He will tell you more. He didn't want me to call this a lecture. He's insisting it's a presentation. So these results came a week ago. So we understand, and it will be like a scoop. Like Aytug, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Is it? No?
Yeah.
Why not? Oh, okay. Thank you very much for being here. It is, as Siam said, my last night in Tunisia for this visit, and it's great to see so many familiar faces, the people I interviewed for this research, the people I work with in different projects, my close friends in Tunisia. Thanks you very much for being here. I'm really excited both about the project and about being able to tell you about the first results. So the main idea of this project, the main execution idea was finishing the data collection on the day of elections last week on May 6th, but then we extended for a week, so the data collection just ended yesterday night. So we've been working very hard with Julia and Alex in Stanford. I will tell you more about them in a minute, about the codes to analyze the data, to clean the data, to create variables, and then to analyze the data. So these are really the first findings of the survey. So please tolerate the amateurishness of the findings in this presentation. So the agenda for today's meeting is motivation. Why did we do this? Why did we conduct this local election candidate survey? How did we do it? How did we do this? What was the design and execution of the survey? And then I'm going to focus on 2 issues tonight, this evening, which are, I think, very important, and it has been part of the public debate about the elections since maybe even before the elections, but especially since the elections. Are the younger candidates different than the older candidates? Because at least almost half of the candidates who got elected are younger candidates that are less than 35 years old. And are the candidates on independent lists different from the candidates on party lists? So these are the 2 main issues as far as I can follow on the Tunisian media and the Twitter or the Facebook, like part of the public debates about the elections since the election day. So I'm going to focus on these findings on these 2 issues, basically. So why did we conduct this quite difficult, I want to say, survey? This is the first democratic local elections in Tunisia the first free and fair local elections in Tunisia. And this is related to many of our dissertation projects. And when I say we, I talk about myself, Julia Clark, also a PhD candidate who is here at the University of California, San Diego, and Alexandra Blackman, also a PhD candidate in political science at the Stanford University. So we all three came together. The idea of it emerged last year in summer, and then we've been working quite hard on this. And then we were able to conduct the survey this spring, just before the election. So I'm working on party building. The first democratic local elections are known to be a very intensive period of party building because it involves lots of candidate recruitment, candidate selection, holding campaigns in different parts of the country. So it's a very intensive period of party building. It's also very important to observe how the democratic transition at the local level affected candidate quality, who becomes a politician, because different municipalities in Tunisia, as Julia Clark will explain in her dissertation, have different experiences of democratic transition after the collapse of the authoritarian regime in the country. And these elections are also very important because it has many institutional regulations about gender quotas and youth quotas. And we will be able to observe how these affected the party strategies, how different types of candidates were selected, and what was the competition between parties and maybe even between candidates in terms of being a candidate, getting to good ranks in the lists. So the main question we are asking basically is, who are the next generation of potential politicians in democratic Tunisia? When local elections happen, when local councilors are elected, then this is becoming a path for them to become politicians also in the national scene. This happened in many other countries in the world. There is a literature about this in political science, which is also flourishing, and we wanted to observe the first instance of democratic local elections in Tunisia quite closely. So as I told you, the preparations began in September 2017. We all came together, and then we found funding for the project from the following organizations, which are Democracy International, Stanford University, a project on Middle East political science, which is based in George Washington University, and then some additional funding from my institution, Harvard University Institute for Quantitative Political Social Science. The survey was implemented by ALCA Consulting. The Director General of ALCA is with us today. We are also very grateful to them for the very successful data collection. There were 60 enumerators in the field doing the data collection for our project. It was self-administered on tablet computers. So it was the enumerators were bringing them the tablets, explaining how to do the data collection. And then they were administering the survey themselves. The candidates were administering the survey themselves. And it took up to 35, on average 35 minutes. It took more than that for many candidates. So I can say the median was probably 35 minutes. And if the respondent prefers not to self-administer the survey, of course the interviewer, the enumerator of ALCA, was helping them, and it was more like a classical respondent interviewer type of survey. So we selected 100 municipalities randomly. We stratified them based on the council size, so which means that from each different types of the council sizes, we selected a weighted amount of municipalities. So these are the municipalities in which the data collection happens. As you can see, they are all over Tunisia. We selected, again, not randomly, because we selected in each municipality Nahda and Nida lists, but then we selected 2 more randomly selected lists, which might be independent lists or party lists or alliance lists. In each in each of the selected lists, we selected 1/3 of the candidates. They were also randomly selected, but we assigned a higher weight to the candidates who were in the upper ranks. So people who were in the upper ranks of their lists were more likely to be selected to our sample. So we came up with more than 2,700 candidates, and then we got a 69% response rate. So the results I'm going to share with you tonight is based on 1911 responses. 1911 responses. So when you think there were I think more than 45,000 candidates in all lists. So this is actually a very good sample size. So this is, we think it is representative of Nahda and Nida lists in the country, also representative of the lists of the candidates who are in winnable rankings, let's say. And I think this, what I said, is proven by the fact that our sample, the distribution of our sample is quite close to the distribution of winners in the age groups. So 38% of the winners were between 18 and 35 years old. Our survey, it's like almost around like 40%, 26% in the second group, 30%, close to 30% in the next group. So our sample, as I said, is quite close to the distribution of winners. And this is also in terms of the gender. So 47% of the winners are female. In our sample, 46% are female. Among the heads of the lists, 30% are female. In our survey also, 30% are female among the heads of the lists. And among the list types, we also observe a similar pattern. 33% of the winning councilors are coming from the independent lists, 30% in our sample, and this pattern is as you see on the screen. So again, just to repeat, our sample we think is representative of the candidates who were in winnable, are in the upper rankings of the lists. So the first topic I'm going to talk tonight is the first substantial topic I'm going to talk is are young candidates different from the older candidates? When we go back to this, as you can see, 38% of the winning candidates are between 18 and 35, and these are considered to be young candidates. They are young, and we are focusing on this not only because I turned 34 recently. I'm literally living the last year of my youth, according to the Tunisian criteria, political criteria. But since we are doing this only because this is a politically and academically interesting topic. So 40%, let's say, almost 40% of the winners or the new councilors of the Tunisian politics are young, less than 35 years old. So the question is, are these different from the older candidates? And the topics I'm going to focus on are the basic demographics, candidacy process, their policy priorities and their policy positions, their level of political knowledge, and their attitudes towards politics. So among the younger candidates, I don't know whether this is well visible. Among the younger candidates, as you can see, more than 60% are female. 66% I think are female. This is in our sample, and I think this would repeat itself also in the all winning candidates. I think this is probably because there were, as you know, quotas for youth and gender in the Tunisian local elections. For instance, among the first 3 candidates in each list, there should be at least one young person, and either 1 or 2, because of the vertical parity, either 1 or 2 female candidates. So this happened, the predominance of women in the younger category happened probably because the parties and the lists tried to kill 2 birds in 1 stone. So if you have a man as the head of the list, the second person who has to be a woman, if this person also happens to be a young person, then you actually satisfy, it has to be a young person, yes. Or the third guy should be a young person. But if you can find a woman who is both at the same time young and a woman, then you actually kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You satisfy 2 criteria with just 1 candidate. And I think this is this pattern is at least a little bit related to this expectation from the parties and the lists. Because in addition to this, I also did some interviews in different parts of Tunisia in 8 different cities, and all party officials or people who constructed independent lists were talking about the difficulty of finding female candidates and young candidates. So if you can satisfy these 2 rules with just 1 candidate, of course, this is very much preferable. The young candidate seems to be more educated than the older candidates, which is expected because the education level is increasing across generations. And 27% have graduate level degrees in the younger cohort. So let me explain. Younger cohort is people between people less than 35 years old. Middle cohort means people between 36 and 45. And the older cohort means people older than 46 years old. And the younger cohort, seems to be more educated in terms of the graduate level degree and also college degree when you compare them with the older cohort. As expectedly, they are more single. 67% of the younger cohort is single as opposed to 2% of the older cohort. But there is also like a substantial portion of the younger cohort which is married. They are much less likely to work in the public sector. So among the older cohort, among the older candidates, more than 50% are working in the public sector. But for the younger cohort, this is 20%. And 30% of the younger cohort is unemployed. So here you see employed in private sector, employed in public sector, self-employed, retired, housewife, student, and unemployed are the employment stata. And it looks like the younger cohort is more likely to work in the private sector, less likely to work in the public sector, and more likely to be unemployed. And they're, of course, more likely to be students. So. They are more likely to have a smaller income. In the younger cohort, 27% report to have a household income, a monthly household income of less than 500 dinars per month. In the older cohort, this is 8%. And when you look at the upper end of this distribution, almost 20% of the older cohort is reporting to have a monthly household income of more than 2,500 dinars, but only 6% of the younger cohort report to be so. So we also had questions about the candidacy, how they became candidates. And younger cohort is reporting, like 32% of the younger cohort is reporting that their candidacy was prompted by somebody who approached them from a party or from a list. And this is a little bit less in the older cohort, 28%. But we also ran some statistical analysis, which I'm not showing here. But I will only report whether the differences are statistically significant, which means that whether we observe the differences by chance. So when I say it is statistically significant, observing the difference by chance, the probability of observing the difference by chance is much less. So this means that. But this difference between the younger cohort and the older cohorts is not statistically significant. So it looks like around 30% of the candidacies was prompted by party or lists, and this is similar for the younger cohorts and the older cohorts. The same with the individual initiative. 50% of the candidates report that candidacy was their own individual initiative, so they approached the parties or the lists or different lists, or they started to create a list. And this is similar across the younger cohort and the older cohort. But when you look at the role they played in the construction of the whole list, because list construction was a difficult business in these elections, because even for a small place, less than 100,000 people, you needed to find like at least 20 people to run with you to create a list if you're an individual. an independent candidate. So constructing the list, bringing together the list was not an easy job. So it was most of the times done by the local party coordinators or regional party coordinators when it comes to parties, or it was done by some people who were investing a lot of time and sometimes maybe money to the construction of the list. But older people say that, like 43% of the older cohort is saying that they played a major role in the construction of the list, like approaching people, doing the ranking, finding people, convincing them to run. But only 29% of the younger cohort is saying that they played a major role. And this is a statistically significant difference. So the chance of observing this difference between the younger cohort and the older cohort by chance, the probability of observing this by chance is quite small, less than 1% in statistical terms. We asked all candidates what their priorities are for the municipality, their policy priorities for the municipality. And we gave them a list of 7 items, and then we asked them to prioritize them. And here you can observe how the younger cohort and the older cohort did it differently. There's not much difference, which might be good for the municipal councils when they are making decisions. Of course, there are some differences. And the figures, what the figures mean is whether this issue was among the top 3 priority of an individual. So, for example, improving local roads was among the top 3 priority for the 65% of the younger cohort. So improving local roads was the first item for the younger cohort, but the second item for the older cohort. This is the people who are more than 46 years old, 45, 46 years old. And the differences are employment opportunities, of course. It was a higher priority for the younger people, and enhancing cultural life was a higher priority, but these differences are quite small. So we also asked, so we had one question type which I should explain. So for this next 7 slides, we gave the respondents 2 sentences, 2 statements, and we asked them to choose one of these statements. So the first one was, which is related to this, whether the government should decrease public employment in Tunisia or continue providing public employment in Tunisia. So the questions we gave them were, in Tunisia, the government should decrease the number of jobs in the public sector because too many people work in the public sector. This is the first sentence. And the second sentence is, the state should continue to provide jobs for people in the public sector because this is the best way to attain a decent life. Of course, this was in Arabic, so which I would be unable to cite right now. So, and we asked them to choose one of these sentences, and they didn't have a chance to say strongly agree or like agree. Just choose one of the sentences, basically. And the 68% of the younger cohort selected the statement which was saying that the government should continue providing public employment, but 42% of the older cohort said so. I mean, when you bring this together with the fact that only 20% of the younger cohort was working for the public sector, but 50% of the older cohort was working for the public sector, this might show that there is some kind of intergenerational conflict about the public sector jobs in Tunisia, among the candidates at least. So the second of these, and this difference was statistically significant. The second of these type of questions was about the reconciliation law, whether the reconciliation law was necessary or whether it was unjust. So they should select between these 2 sentences. It was unjust or it was necessary to attract investment. But the difference between the age cohorts in this question is not statistically significant. And it might be interesting that the 60%, more than 60% of the candidates overall think that, or at least report that the reconciliation law was necessary. Environmental protection, whether people should prioritize environmental protection over, or the government should prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. When we asked about this, the younger people are more pro-environmental protection. Although the difference is small, it is a statistically significant difference. So 70% of the younger cohort says that the government should prioritize environmental protection over economic growth, so economic investments can be curbed if there is an environmental need to do so. But the other people selected that 30% of the younger cohort selected that no, economic growth has priority. We can harm environment if we are going to create jobs or attract investment. So another similar question was about the security versus democratic rights. Security might require limiting democratic rights. Security is not an excuse to constrain democratic rights. 48% of the younger cohort said that security is not an excuse to constrain democratic rights, but we do not observe a statistically significant difference across between age cohorts for this question. So it's a 50-50 basically for the candidates. We asked candidates, so these, the next three items are about the debate in the decentralization, about the decentralization in Tunisia. We observed that as the researchers, me, Julia, and Alex, I'm not the only one to blame, sorry. We observed that like one of the important issues of the decentralization debate in Tunisia was whether the distribution of the natural resource revenues should be distributed equally among the regions, or should the region of the production for that natural resource should be prioritized or not. And 30% of the younger cohort said that, younger cohort of candidates said that the region in which the production is happening should be prioritized for the revenues, but only 19% of the older cohort said so. And this is a statistically significant difference. Is this becoming repetitive? Another debate, another issue in the decentralization debate is whether the governor should be able to dissolve the municipal council when he or she, mostly he, but there is also a female governor, as far as I know. He can dissolve the municipal council when he deems it necessary. So this, among the candidates, the like predominantly popular answer was no. The government shouldn't be able to dissolve the municipal council, and 80% of them said no. And the younger cohort also said by 80% no. And then we didn't observe a statistically significant difference across age cohorts. Whether the municipalities should should use participatory governance methods all the time for the municipal. Or as much as possible for the municipal decision making, or should another position was like no, municipal council members are elected people, so they don't need to use participatory methods, participatory budgeting, or just like open citizen meetings all the time. So when we asked the candidates to select between these two positions, more than 80% of them said that they should use pro-participatory methods type of approach, and the younger cohort slightly said more. 83% of them said that they should use participatory methods for decision making at the municipal level, but we don't observe any statistically significant difference across age cohorts. So we had in the survey we had 3 questions about gender equality, basically whether men should be prioritized when there is a scarcity of places in the higher education or scarcity of jobs, or men are better political leaders than women, type of questions, type of statements. And then we created a gender equality index, gender equality opinion index. And the younger cohort, so you score the highest when you disagree with all these 3 statements. So when you strongly disagree with all 3 of them, so this is a different type of question. When you strongly disagree with all 3 of them, so you score 9. So the younger cohort, the 20% of the younger cohort scored 9. Middle cohort, the 15% of the middle age cohort scored 9, and 15% of the older cohort scored 9. Although we observed a little bit of difference here when you explore it visually, this difference is not statistically significant. So the younger cohort is not more pro-gender equality. And we had another chance to observe whether they actually practice gender equality in their lives. We asked the married ones, the married candidates, how they divide the household tasks between them. And 34% of the younger cohort said the wife, the female party in the marriage is doing it all. And only 36% said that they are sharing it equally. And we also do not observe any statistically significant difference here across cohorts. So also in the practice aspect, there is no gender equality in the younger cohort. There is no more gender equality in the younger cohort. I mean, if any, actually there is, I guess, in the older cohort there is more gender equality. So, but this is not a statistically significant difference. So I'm not allowed to say that. So we also had 3 statements about political secularism. The government and parliament should enact laws in accordance with Islamic law. It is better when religious people hold public office in the state. Religious practice is a private matter and should be separated from political life. So some of them are like inverse measures, some of them are positive measures. So when we create a political secularism index, it is, there's a statistically significant difference, and the younger cohort seems to be less inclined for political secularism. So one of the important questions of this debate is, since the elections, is whether the old RCD members are becoming municipal council members. So in our survey, 12% of people reported that they were indeed RCD members before 2011. In the younger cohort, we observed this much less, of course, but this is constrained to people only older than 25 years old. So even if like people who could have been members of RCD before 2011, people who have been more than 18 years old before 2011 basically, but still the younger cohort was much less likely to be RCD member. I mean, a natural finding, but still a finding. So you could expect that the younger cohort of candidates should have participated more frequently in the 2010-2011 uprising, which doesn't seem to be the case according to the data. The older cohort, 22% of the older cohort, that they report that they have participated in the uprising quite frequently, but only 17% of the younger cohort is reporting that they are participating in the 2010-11 uprising, but this is not a statistically significant difference, across age cohorts. And the younger cohort seems to be less likely to have voted in 2014 legislative elections. Again, this is constrained to people who could have voted in 2014 elections, who were older than 18 in 2014. But 82% of them voted, of the younger cohort voted in 2014 legislative elections. 95% of the older cohort voted in the legislative elections in 2014. This is the usual case. I mean, in most countries, the older people vote more. I think, I mean, even though we observe a statistically significant difference, 82% of the younger cohort of candidates, the fact that 82% of the younger cohort of candidates have voted in 2014 legislative elections is a good thing. So, I mean, this difference is quite small, but statistically significant. So we had 3 questions about political knowledge of candidates. The questions were: who is your governor in your governorate? How many seats are there in your municipal council? Which was the easiest question because this was also the size of their list. So this was the most common correct answer. The second A more difficult question was, who is your governor? And the most difficult question was, which is the second biggest bloc in the National Assembly right now? Since it kind of changed after the elections, we thought this is a question which could measure how they closely follow politics, because NIDA was the biggest bloc right after the elections, but then they became the second biggest bloc after the split in the party. So these three questions, through these three questions, we measured their level of political knowledge, and 9% of the younger cohort knew all three questions correctly, and the 22% of the older cohort was able to answer all three questions correctly. And this is a statistically significant difference, which means that the younger cohort is probably following politics less closely. And we also asked them whether they would run for 2019 elections. I mean, we asked more questions, obviously, but this is just a selection of questions. And the younger cohort is more ambitious to run in the 2019 legislative elections. 18% of them said that they will definitely run, as opposed to 9% of the older cohort. And 48% of the younger cohort said that they will run depending on the circumstances, if an opportunity presents itself, if I repeat the question verbatim. And 23% of the older cohort said so. I think this is quite good. So they are basically dreaming about running for the legislative elections, which is basically the next step in the political path. So just to take a stock in the comparison between the younger and older candidates, young candidates are more educated, more likely to be female, more likely to be unemployed, and more likely to have less income. They played a smaller role in the construction of the list than the older cohort. They prioritized public employment opportunities in the municipalities and cultural life slightly more than the older cohort. Public employment and environmental protection are more important for them. They are slightly less inclined for political secularism, less likely to have voted in 2014 elections, less likely to follow politics closely, and more likely to run for 2019 elections. 2019 elections. That's a typo which I also repeated. So the next question that I want to focus in less slides is, are candidates on independent lists different from the candidates on party lists? So why am I not saying independent candidates and party candidates? Because there are also many people that I talked to in my field research who said that they are independent candidates who are running on party lists. So especially one party, and Nahda, said that they opened their lists, 50% of their lists to the independent candidates, and those independent candidates were actually quite insistent on the fact that they are independent candidates just running on party lists. So just to follow the same pattern here as well, so we are here comparing the candidates on independent lists, non-partisan, non-alliance lists, to the candidates on party lists. There is no difference across these two groups in terms of education. I mean, the resemblance is actually uncannily similar. So in terms of education, 20.4% of people in the independent lists have graduate degrees, and the same percentage has graduate degrees in the party lists. So the mean age for independent lists is, candidates in independent lists is 40. The mean age for the party lists is 41. So there is a statistically significant difference, but the substantial difference is so small. So, and here you see the distribution in a density plot. So this is a statistically significant result, but substantially, I mean, 40 and 41 doesn't make much difference. In employment status, we see that the people in the independent lists are more likely to be unemployed. I didn't run a statistical test for this. I wouldn't want to guide you incorrectly about this. So, because this is a demographic variable, I didn't run a statistical significance test for this. 49% of people in the party list seem to be working in the in the public sector, whereas it's 33% for people in the independent lists. for the candidates in the independent lists. People running in the independent lists are more likely to have less income, basically, less monthly household income. 22% are having an income less than 500 dinars in the independent lists. 17% of people, of candidates in the party lists, have the same level of income. So, and this is a statistically significant difference. People in independent lists, people running on the independent lists are having less income. One of the, of course, important advantages of having an independent list rather than a party list was having more control over the list, because you do not have to follow party instructions coming from the headquarters or coming from the regional offices, or and you can come together with other people, with other similar-minded people, and create your own list. And it looks like the independents did use this advantage. 50% of the people in the independent lists reported that they played a major role in the construction of the list, whereas 32% of the people in the party lists reported to do so, to have done so. And this is a statistically significant difference across two groups. So whether there was a difference between the policy priorities of people running in independent lists and party lists, the difference seemed to be very small. Again, we see a similar pattern to the one that we observed in the comparison between the younger cohort and the older cohort. The independent people who were more likely to be unemployed are prioritizing creating employment opportunities for younger people more than their counterparts, equivalents in the party lists. And the other ones are basically ranked in the same manner. 59% of people who are running in the independent lists think that the government should continue providing public employment, shouldn't decrease the level of public employment in Tunisia, whereas 54% of people who run in the party lists think so, and this is a statistically significant difference, which means that the people who ran in independent lists are more likely to ask for the continuation of the public employment in Tunisia. And when it comes to reconciliation law, 40% of people in the independent lists think that the reconciliation law was unjust, as opposed to the 34% of people in the party lists. And again, this is a statistically significant difference. So people in the independent lists are have more negative reaction for the reconciliation law. The other policy position questions didn't have a difference between the independent lists and party lists, so I'm not repeating them. When it comes to gender equality, there is no difference between the same gender equality opinion index, no difference between independent lists and the party lists. No statistical significance difference between division of household tasks. If anything, the party lists seem to be a little bit more egalitarian than independent lists. When it comes to secularism, the independent lists are slightly more inclined for political secularism. This might be the Nahda effect among the party lists. The fact that Nahda is counted in the party among the party lists, of course. When it comes to civic activism, and what I mean by civic activism, we asked the candidates whether they did the following activities in the last year: attended a municipal council meeting, which might be important for some friends of us who is in the audience. She's not paying attention to me right now. Participated in a demonstration or rally. Engaged in a political discussion on social media. Lana Salman is doing research about the municipal council meetings, and she spent 1.5 years observing them, so I just made a reference to that. So, contacted your MP and served on the board of a non-profit organization, and based on these 5 items we create the civic activism list, and it looks like the people who are in the independent lists are less likely to have engaged in civic activism civic activities in the last year. So only 24% of people in the party lists reported that they haven't done any of these activities in the last year. 31% of the people who ran in independent lists report that they didn't do any of these. So they are less engaged in civic activism in the independent lists. Interestingly, among the independent lists and party lists, we have almost the same figure in terms of the RCD membership before 2011. 12%, exactly almost exactly the same percentage of people report that they were members of RCD before 2011. This, of course, is not a statistically significant difference. When we ask them whether they participated in 2010 and 2011 uprising, independent people report a slightly higher level of participation in 2010 and 2011 uprisings, but this is not a statistically significant difference. I guess this is definitely statistically significant. So we asked candidates whether they trust in parties and politicians. And 31% of people who are running in independent lists said that they don't trust. They said that said that the parties and politicians work to their own benefit. And 11% of people who run in party lists said so. So this is unexpected, but I think still interesting result. When it comes to political knowledge, candidates who are running on independent lists are less knowledgeable, according to our index, about politics. And even if I take out the question about the parties, about Nida and Nahda, this pattern still holds. So they're also less knowledgeable about their local politics, the questions about the governor and the seat size, council size. And they have a very similar level of political ambition for running in 2019 legislative elections. So just to summarize what I reported about this comparison between the candidates on independent lists and candidates on party lists. They are slightly younger, they have less household income, they played a larger role in the construction of the list, prioritize creating employment for younger people slightly more, public employment more important for them, they are less likely to support the reconciliation law, they are slightly more inclined for political secularism. They have less experience in civic activism. They have less trust in parties and politicians. And they are less likely to follow politics closely. And they have a similar level of ambition. I mean, I just want to also report a little bit about my interview-based research as well about the independent lists. What I observed about the independent lists in the field was there are basically 3 different types of independent lists. So because of the horizontal parity, some parties, especially the smaller parties, had difficulties in finding, or they actually didn't want to run female-headed lists. So what they did was basically running half of the lists, and they were actually, I mean, some of the local coordinators or regional coordinators of medium-sized parties told me this. So they basically ran half of their male-headed lists as independents. So the fact that we don't observe much difference between the independent lists and party lists is the fact because that some of the independent lists were actually constructed as party lists, but ran as independent lists. The second category was, I think. But you said you corrected for that, no? No, there is no way. There is no way to correct for that. And some is really independent, no? They are nominally independent. They look like independent lists. But there's no way to know exactly which one is. Yeah. So I mean, you cannot ask them directly because they wouldn't report on this. Because running as an independent list was actually a badge of honor in these elections in Tunisia, because there were people were very much actually, since they are very much like distrusting parties in this particular political time, in this point of history in Tunisia. So basically, running as an independent list was a badge of honor. And some of the parties actually followed this as a strategy. So they wouldn't tell you, even if you ask them, although we tried in different ways. There's no way to know exactly which independent lists are actually party lists. I mean, there are ways, of course, but there were no way for this particular research method. The second, I think, category of the independent lists were basically also bigger parties followed the same strategy as well. So in some places, NIDA ran alternative independent lists because they couldn't find enough places for the people who wanted to be in the municipal council in their main party list. There were some dissidents from, basically this happened, I think, mostly to the NIDA, as far as I could observe. There were dissidents who were unhappy with the ranking they were offered, and therefore they left the party list and created an independent list just to get elected. And most of the time, these independent lists, beginning from the second, were position fillers, if I may say so. There were also reports that the other parties also used the same approach, running one nominal party list and another independent list to get as many seats as possible. And then there were third type of independent lists, which were really like beginning from the construction phase. They were constructed as independent citizen lists. And I think that one good indicator of this might be having a female head of the list, because only 3%, only 4%, 3.5%, I guess, of all independent lists had a female head. And this is, I think, telling. And since many of the parties use independent lists to have a male head as the head of the list, I think this might be, having a female head of the list might be a good indicator, at least a sufficient indicator, not a necessary indicator, but a sufficient indicator, which can show that you are actually a kind of like a real citizen constructed lists, which is outside of the control of parties. So these are coming from more like qualitative observations rather than survey observations. Which is to say that, I mean, the fact that we do not observe much difference between the candidates of independent lists and candidates of party lists might be stemming from that, so in the survey data. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Much, Aytug.
Thank you.
Questions from it's not on? Is it on? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Aytug. I know the data is still fresh. It's still coming, as you were describing, just was coming in yesterday. But I was wondering if you had a chance to just have like initial thoughts about what this data actually means, and whether part of the analysis is your impression of how surprising or not, or unexpected or not this data is. So for me, from where I'm standing, from where I stand, I was personally surprised by how insignificant the differences between the younger and older candidates are. Especially something that really struck me was and the priorities for the local municipal councils is creating public employment, for example. For me, I would have thought that all the older candidates would be more pro-public employment than the younger ones. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's that's something that struck me. And also cultural events, for example, the difference was very small between the older and the younger generations, especially that in the discourse of Tunisian politics, youth are portrayed as being less, quote-unquote, less experienced in, quote-unquote, politics. On the one hand, you have that discourse, and on the other, you also have youth being at the forefront of the revolution, and this is one of the first few elections after the revolution. So if you can talk a little bit about that, what you think is going on or not. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is a really great question. To start, I mean, when you are, so I've been here since January and just like thinking about the local elections and how the parties recruit candidates a lot, talking to people. So when you are that involved, I think it's quite difficult, at least for me, to get out and see what is surprising or not. So I basically need much more time with the data to be able to observe and to create a much more like a coherent story, basically, or theory. I was also surprised by, I mean, having said that, I was also a little bit surprised by the fact that there are not much differences in terms of the, like, for instance, participation in the 2010-2011 uprisings. This might be related to the fact that how lists and parties select their candidates. On the one hand, and I'm saying this in a very reserved way because we need more data about that and more thinking about that. This might be related to the fact that first, the people, the young people who participated in the making of the revolution might be very much shying away of doing electoral and party politics first. And then the second part is, and I think this is quite a common pattern in today's Tunisia. The second might be the fact that the parties might not have targeted them to have them in their lists. So therefore, maybe we are not seeing a statistical difference between the revolution participation of the younger cohort and of the older cohort. So they might, so these two, if you look at these two patterns at the same time, the people who were much more proud of actually participating in the revolution might not have been part of these lists, unfortunately. I think it was a great opportunity for these people to start engaging in electoral and party politics, either through independent lists and or through party lists. And I think therefore it was a very important moment of party building in Tunisia. The first local democratic elections are. But there's also this like very high level of distrust for elections and parties in today's Tunisia. And I think this is affecting probably all parties, but some parties more than others. So I don't know whether this was an answer, but that's the extent of what I can say at the moment about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I think there's a lot of information in there that was questioning common perceptions, common sense maybe. I had a few questions that I wanted to ask you. There was one number about there was a sort of discrepancy between people who said it was from their own initiative that they joined the list, and people who said they were enlisted to run. I think it was 50% and 30%. So there was a missing sort of 20%. Is there some other reason you think that might be outside of that binary for why people say they would join to run? And the other question I had when I was a bit surprised about the reconciliation law numbers. You mentioned something about it being tied to investment. Was the question framed linked to investment, that the reconciliation law is necessary to attract investment? And then my final question was, sorry, I have it here. I wrote it down. Sorry. Oh, the question was about that you had asked about public sector employment. What prompted that question? I feel like there's very few analysts from different disciplines who even consider that it's a policy question, that public sector employment could be perhaps increased. So what prompted that question?
If I go from the reverse order, so I mean, public sector in the political economy of the Middle East discipline, like Weatherbury, Melanie Kemet, and Isaac Divan's last volume, the level of public employment in the Middle East in general is always problematized. I mean, problematized in the sense that it is interesting to observe the high level, and also and I'm not maybe in a. Yeah, please.
Okay, now it's on. So one of the reasons we included the question is because to get at the sort of austerity measures without calling them austerity per se. But right now, there's sort of a big push as part of the World Bank, IMF-backed austerity measures to reduce the size of the public sector. So we were trying to get at that without saying austerity measures, and sort of, because we thought we would get a more honest answer if we didn't say that specific term as well.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, also in the disciplines also it is important, like public sector employment is important debate. I think also in the public, in the Tunisian public as well. So I see more and more, as much as my Arabic allows, more and more articles about that in the newspapers as well. So I think it is important to see what people think about it, especially the ones who might be the next generations of politicians. So therefore, we put the question. The reconciliation law question, I can read it to you directly. So the economic but what we were trying to do is just like trying to imitate what the people who advocated for the reconciliation law was saying. So rather than putting our own thoughts about into that, of course. The economic reconciliation law, and we put the full name of the law here, was necessary to attract investment and create employment. The sentence B was, the economic reconciliation law provided an unnecessary and unjust amnesty for past offenses. So these were the two statements from which they chose. The last question, what prompted the candidacy question. So there were 4 different options, and they were able to select multiple of them. So there are more than 100% in total. And the other 2 options were, I was encouraged by family, friends, or colleagues, or I was encouraged or I was pushed by a civil society association to run. So these were 4. And I think we took this question from a candidate survey, from an international candidate survey.
Thank you for the very interesting questions and interesting numbers. I have 2 questions. The first one is about the governor. Actually, I was extremely surprised by the reactions to whether the governor should dissolve the elected council or not. Even though, I mean, I wish that the answers are this, but I feel like the question might have biased the answers, because the choice of words. Why is it the governor and not the government, for example, or the executive branch? Because the process is really not the governor. It's through the government. And I think that might have produced different answers, especially that from the partisan parties. I mean, many of them are represented in the government. So as opposed to the governor, which is a closer power that might influence them and might directly suggest limiting their independence. So I'm very curious about that, about the choice of words. And what other data would we need in order to add more nuance to that answer? Because I think it's too extreme. That would suggest that people are...
80%
yes.
is saying...
Yes. This is just out of intuition or maybe experience. My second question is about the participation in legislative elections. You said that that's good, that most of them are interested in running for 2019. My reaction would have been that it's bad because it means that their participation was not specific to local power, and that, so if you can give your comments on that. Thank you.
Reverse order, maybe. I mean, especially at this stage, I am trying to become as least normative as I can be about the results. I said it might be good because they think about politics and running again, which I think might be important. And not. And when you look at the results, so not like half of them say that they would consider running. So it's not like all of them are trying to do this to become in the half is also quite high. So again, I'm trying to be as least normative as I can be at this point about this. The other question about the governor, I might be wrong about that, and I'm sure you know this much better than I do. But the discussion, as far as I followed, was about whether the action was going to be made by the governor, right? The dissolution of the municipal council thing. This was a debate in the Majalla, no?
It's not possible because it's going to be a governmental decree. So in any case, it's supposed to be discussed among ministers who are represented from
the dissolution of a particular municipal council.
Yes, it's suggested by the governor, but it's a governmental decree. So I think that additional
might be the case. Might be the case, definitely. I think the fact that also 80% is saying that they would always use participatory methods is kind of saying that they are very much keen on keeping it as decentralized as possible. So the candidates are willing to keep the local government, because it is almost the same number. 80% is saying also they should use participatory methods as many times as possible.
So the word participatory also sounds very positive. So I think in those two numbers, if they look alike, the wording might have really influenced the.
Yes, but I mean, in the survey research, there's no way that wording doesn't affect the answers. So, and again, we are just trying to imitate, and there might be a variation in the success of this, but we are just trying to imitate the public debate as much as possible. Yeah, what was the last? There was one more question.
What other data?
Yes. So this was my answer to that. Like the fact that they are very much willing to use participatory methods as much as possible. What other data can be used to see this? I mean, just to what prompts my thinking about that is like what other method can be used? Why younger cohort is not different? For instance, the Democracy International is collecting more data about voters, and we are going to ask all of them whether they considered to run or whether they were approached by any party or by any list to run. So we can see what type of people have even considered to run, or maybe they might have said no, even though they got an offer, and then we can say more about like what segment of young people wanted to run.
Shame already asked a couple of the questions I was about to ask, but I do have a follow-up. In the timing of these questions, do you have, can you just give us an idea on how many of these questions or portions of the questionnaire was conducted before the law was passed a couple of weeks ago?
That's a great question. When was the law exactly passed? I can give you a more exact number.
I think it was 2 weeks ago, was it?
I think
it was about 2 weeks ago.
So probably one third was collected before, during the debate in the parliament, and 2/3 after the debate in the parliament.
Okay.
It was finished. So
I mean, I don't know whether or not that would have made a difference.
that would be so interesting to explore. Thank you for the idea.
I only have one more question, but I do have a couple of remarks. Tunisian party building has been centralized in Tunis since 2011. Very, very few parties, with the exception of one or two, have actually ventured outside of Tunis. And all of a sudden, there is the municipal elections. And so many of them have rushed to either open offices, and mostly many, if not all, have been enabled to do so, with the exception perhaps of Nahda and maybe and somewhat Nida. Others have looked and resorted to finding local sort of heroes, you know, opinion leaders, and build at least around that individual. Did that at all enter into your, when you were putting the questions together, has that sort of entered the thinking of perhaps how you should phrase a question? And then just one other question, so you can, the questions were presented in Arabic, I suppose. Yeah. We here in Tunisia don't have very good taste right now in our mouth with polling and companies that do polling. And so were the questions just handed to people on tablets, let's say, and then they answered them themselves? Or was there someone to, I guess the answer was yes.
Yes.
First part. Both, okay. Because, and with these people, Tunisians, locals from those cities?
Yes.
Okay. from that region. And so my last question, that was a remark. Last question, I don't know if you omitted it on purpose, or I was expecting to see something about funding. A question with regard to how the campaigns were funded, and whether or not people chose to go on an independent list or on a party list because of or lack of funding.
Again, in the reverse order, we had a question about the challenges they had through the campaigning period, and one of the potential answers is lack of funding. So we can definitely see. I mean, we have so many questions. I just like a little bit deliberately select. I mean, not out of any particular choice, but I selected these questions for today. We can observe whether the lack of funding was a bigger problem for the independent lists versus the party lists. The fact that the local the local organization of many parties, quite possibly including NIDA, was weak, was basically one of the reasons why we did this. Because, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, you might have come a little bit late, maybe. Oh, maybe. The first democratic local elections were very much an instance of intensive party building. And party building exactly is this, is finding people who you think are similar-minded, and then you are trying to create an office or a more like a formal representation. So this definitely informed the selection of our questions. How successful we were on that is, I guess, up to debate. We definitely took this into consideration. Did I miss any questions? How the survey was implemented. It was implemented by local people who were mostly from these regions, by Alka Consulting, with more than 60 enumerators, and the enumerators were explaining what we were doing, taking their consent, informed consent, explaining them who is doing this, why they are doing this, how this is going to be kept confidential, how their individual information will never be shared, and then their informed consent was taken, and then the tablet was given to them. And there is, I guess, some finding about the fact that people, when they just do it on a tablet, people are much more honest about their answers because they don't have to voice it to a stranger. So I think in that sense, and we don't have much missing data, which is also, I think, is a good thing about the quality of data. So yeah, these are...
Just a quick follow-up question. Given this data that you have now, the results, have you any intentions of a follow-up with some of these independents or some of the parties that have won seats?
We do, but this is a little bit tricky because you have to take informed consent about the panel study before you do this. So just to follow up with them. We didn't do that, and I don't think it would be. I'm not sure about that. So. Julia, do you have anything to add on that?
We would like to do that. We've talked about it and talked about other, possibly, again, implementing a similar version of this with revised questions for the next 5 years, so that with it would be with new people, but to sort of see if there's change over time, and it would let us help better calibrate some of the questions, and all of your feedback here is great for that too. But yeah, I mean, I think we can talk to our IRBs about it would be funding necessary.
We are under ethical supervision of 3 different IRBs, institutional review boards, Harvard, Stanford, and UCSC. So we have to take permission for every step that we take. So therefore, I'm being quite hesitant to say something clear about that. So.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
You focused your analysis on the difference between young and older people, candidates. And actually, in many areas, the difference is not so significant, especially on gender equality. My question is, did you look to the difference according to gender among young people or among older people, or to other variables as education, as age, education, and what else? Gender, age, and education.
Julia.
So we've just been both, but there's so much, this survey is about 115 questions. So it's a lot to parse, and between the three of us, we've just been sort of diving in wherever we can. So in the last few days, I don't have fancy graphs, I don't have my computer here, but I was looking at a number of these variables divided by gender. So sort of one big question we wanted to answer is, are female candidates as qualified as male candidates? Because you hear anecdotally, a lot of parties had difficulty finding women. People are worried that they're just going to find someone's sister who's not interested in politics, and she fills the list and she doesn't do anything, and the council will be bad quality. We hear it all the time in the media, on Twitter and Facebook. So we wanted to see if that's actually true. So what I can tell you from our very, very early analysis, and this is, I haven't even downloaded the data in the last week, so this is with even, I think, 1,600 observations. Women are controlling for age and party and location and municipality and income and ranking and lots of other things, more educated on average than men. They're more likely to have a university degree or a master's degree. Interestingly enough, when you run an interaction model with rank, the most educated women are at the bottom of the list. So they were actually the least likely to be elected. So the position at the top of the list,
less likely.
Less likely to be the ones who actually end up on the council. Well, but the most qualified ones are at the bottom. So the fillers, or not the fillers, but the ones that maybe have more party loyalty, or there's some other reason that they would be at the top of the list besides raw education, is an interesting story. Yeah, funding, et cetera, connections, you know, how long they've been a member of the party, lots of other things go into this. Women also score higher on the ambition measure. So whether or not they're more likely to run for parliament in the future, women on average respond that they're more likely, so that's perhaps encouraging or perhaps not, depending on how you think about the question. On all the other measures, we have 7 different measures of quality. The rest I too talked about are, do you have experience? Have you run for office before? Have you served in public administration? Have you served on a local council? Are you a member of civil society organizations and religious associations and sports clubs and all of these things that we think might give you sort of leadership skills and connections and organizational ability that will help you do your job? Women score less on all of those things.
Even though they are more
Even though they're more educated and controlling for, you know, age, income, et cetera. So the story, again, this is very early, but that seems to sort of pop out at me, is that we did not get worse quality female candidates as measured by things like education, but in fact, women haven't yet had the opportunity to gain all of the sort of experience that people often think of as being a measure of quality. So hopefully, with these quotas, if we redid this survey in 5 years, we would find much more parity. I mean, having been elected, all the women that are elected would now score higher on the sort of quality measures of having experience, right? So thinking about what will be the effect of the quota over time, will it actually bring women into the political sphere to give them more of the sort of, political experience, you know, et cetera, over time, is sort of an open question. So.
About their opinion, for example, on gender equality.
I haven't gotten to that question yet in my coding, so I will keep you posted.
One other thing about women is, and this was also very visible in the field visits as well, they did play very little role in making the lists. Women did. So this, the politics, although there are quotas, are still a very male-dominated environment in Tunisia. And like out of maybe like 30 people I talked to among the regional and local party officers who directly constructed the lists, all of them were men. So yeah, so there is definitely, I mean, the quotas are definitely very useful, but whether they affect parties in terms of like the gatekeepers, because this is called in the literature as gatekeepers, political gatekeepers, who decide who will be members, who recruit the members, the candidates. They are very predominantly male.
So thank you very much for the very interesting, insightful presentation. I'm excited about your data. I'm looking forward for further findings. Now, I have a couple of questions. The first is 1/3, 1% out of 3 that you asked to respond did not respond. Almost 1/3, 31%. I wonder if you looked into what they look like. And therefore, if you speculated on what kind of biases that introduces. And if you can think, and speculate on that. The second one is if you carried out already some preliminary cross analysis, both on geography and on the council size, besides the two that you presented here today. The third is very specific, I wonder if you asked membership in civil society organizations or social movements of candidates, whether or not they belong to that. That specific question alone unpacked from all the rest of civic engagement. And I just wanted to share with you a quote regarding the women most qualified actually being presented down the list. Madeleine Albright, first Foreign Secretary, actually said that women enter the administration usually by filling the spot of men, and they were picked among the mediocre ones. And then finally, some capable women were given the chance to enter into public space.
So just to talk about the last quote, this is very much about also the debate in the candidate recruitment. There is always, from the perspective of the party, incumbent party elites, choice between loyalty and competence. So they want to choose loyal people because they don't want to have challengers, but they also want to have competent people because they want to win elections. So I mean, we were talking a bit, Julia, about this yesterday, and I think the theory might be evolving into that. About the response rate, the people who directly refused to answer are actually much less than 31%. Most of them, they either didn't have much time for the appointment, they didn't show up to the appointment, although they say they will, and then they came up with another appointment. So the refusal rate is actually much less than 31%. We didn't have the chance yet to explore whether there was a response bias, but from some ballpark estimations, there is not much difference in a party across parties, for instance. So there is no response bias across parties. It's not like NIDA people answered and NAFTA people didn't answer. They are basically the same rate, and this is the case for almost all parties. But we have to check more for this. So we didn't have a chance to do this yet. I didn't. So the results that I presented today, when I say statistically significant, which this means that I put municipality fixed effects. So we control for the geography, basically. But I didn't check whether there are differences across different geographical regions of Tunisia yet. We do ask about their membership in different types of organizations, and they are like business associations, civil society associations, religious organizations, sports organizations. So we do ask this question for each type of civil society organization. Yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation, and I know this is collective work, and one of your colleagues is here. And Alex is not here, but this is great, so thank you. And thank you for hollering at me while I was mindlessly distracted about this. I guess so I have two related questions, or maybe one, and excuse the naivete of this question. I am not a political scientist, and I don't do survey research, but my question is, what is the motivation for this project, right? Because once you present people with certain answers and not others, and then you express counter to expectation or as expectation, it means there's a particular motivation, right? Like that you expect to see certain results because something is driving these questions or assumptions. So one very particular example was when you present candidates with priorities, what is the priority for your city? And you compare young people versus old people, and they set them with priorities. So what makes you choose these and not others? Or even include questions as big as secularism, views on secularism versus whether you want to improve roads or stop informal construction. So what for you as researchers, what motivates these particular questions and the particular answers you give, because we end up seeing results and we believe them in the way you present them, but we don't know kind of the thought process that went into this prior to that.
Great question. I mean, I tried to explain the motivation in the beginning a little bit. This is the first democratic local elections. So that since we are doing this as 3 different people, we are interested in 3 different, basically, research agenda. My question is about the challenges of party building. As this gentleman also said, so this is a very important and intensive period of party building. So I'm trying to observe who are targeted by different parties. Who are they trying to get as the future of their parties, basically. Julia is looking at the effects of the democratic transition at the local level, because there were different patterns of transition from the authoritarian regime in different localities. So how did this affect the candidate qualities, or how the level of competition in a particular municipality? And we are all interested, but I think Julia and Alex are more interested about this, to look at the effects of the gender and youth quotas. But the particular question, these are the things which are related to our research agenda, but the question we are interested is, who are trying to become a local council member, who are investing time in this, who wants to be a politician in the future generations of Tunisia. These type of larger questions, I guess, is I think our motivation. The specific selection of the questions are definitely informed by this multiplicity of motivations. But also, I mean, when you do this type of research, you basically, we started like a 200 question survey, basically, which was, and Elka was saying that impossible. So you just out of curiosity, some of the things are just popping. You just want to ask and understand as much as possible. The secularism question, since you mentioned that, the secularism question we put because I'm interested in the challenges of building non-Islamist secular parties. So both the motivation or the willingness to hold the survey and the selection of the specific questions are informed by these motivations, by this multiplicity of motivations, basically.
I'd actually just like to ask a follow-up question regarding your question about secularism. So I was wondering if you can tell us what term, if you remember, if you used the Arabic term in Arabic, al-maniyya, and if you said before that you gave a few statements that I believe people had to express, like disagree, agree, strongly agree. I'm just wondering what those different statements are, and I'm especially interested, Aytug, because at the end you said that the youth do not particularly support political secularism. So I was wondering what political secularism meant, and if this is maybe in relation to the questions that you asked.
So when we are making these comparisons, we reached the end of the question, right? I didn't interrupt you. Your question was ended, right? Okay. So the questions that we asked, we never said secularism to the candidates. The questions are the statements which we asked the candidates to either strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree are: the government and parliament should enact laws in accordance with Islamic law. It is better when religious people hold public office in the state. Religious practice is a private matter and should be separated from political life. So these are basically quite classical questions which are used in survey research, in World Values Survey, Arab Barometer, Afrobarometer. So we are kind of like taking them as much as possible from already tested statements. So, and then we basically, based on these questions, based on these answers, we create an index. Because we cannot, I mean, since this is a quite like a complicated topic, it is even questionable that you measure this by 3 questions. Just by 1 question wouldn't be good enough. But I mean, all research methodologies have their own limitations. So this is, I think, quite a good measure for this, for political secularism. Did I answer the question? Of course, we don't say, "Are you a secular person?" type of thing. Sometimes you use this too, but I don't know. Yeah.
It's not the question; it's an observation from my last
campaign in my town. I think the gender of the head of the list impacts the dynamic of the list.
Yeah, we definitely want to check that
if
too.
I may recommend you take that into consideration.
Yes, I think that too. The problem is there are so few female-headed independent lists. I am very much worried that whether we captured them in our sample, because there are only 4%, which means that out of 860 independent lists, there were 32. Probably we couldn't capture enough of them to say representative things about them. But I don't know whether this pattern, I kind of agree with you. I was able to observe 2 or 3 actually independent lists which were headed by women, including yours. I kind of think that was also the case, that it definitely affects. But I don't know whether this is also the case for the party lists, because the way parties pick their female heads is that it is a different calculation because of the horizontal parity. There was a competition among the local party officials who were trying to get a visa, get the authority for a male head of the list from their regional office. So they were basically trying to say that my town is more conservative, my town is more competitive, I should have a male head. So therefore having a female head might not have the same effect in the party lists. But we will of course check. So this is what I like about the mixed research, by the way, just like to be able to see from different angles what is going on. So
you would like to ask a question, Aytug?
No.
So if you are trying to understand who becomes a politician, will this maybe help, or I don't know, out of this data, if you can say who does never become a politician? Who are these people who are not interested, not involved, who are not willing to contribute?
No, you can't say anything from this data about that, because this would be what we call selection on the dependent variable problem. These are all people who opted to be in the political system, as framed in the electoral political system, let's say. So Democracy International is running a very large national representative survey, and we put lots of questions into that survey, which are inspired by the questions in that survey. So we will have the chance to compare the people who opted in to the electoral system and who opted out of the electoral system. So we will be able to say more about this. And I have a gut feeling that there will be quite a big proportion who very deliberately opted out of the electoral game. So I mean, that wouldn't be $1 million finding, I guess. The real question is why. So.
About the questions that were administered or were presented to the candidates. Was it in Fusha, Arabic, Fusha, or was it in Tunisian, Darja? And can you talk about whether that wasn't an issue at all that you discussed?
Well, of course an issue.
I wonder, because like surveys, I don't know how it works here in Tunisia. I've never taken a survey, but I just wonder, just in general, what language, whether it's Darja or Fusha, that is used to administer surveys in general, and in particular related to politics, and how you thought about that particular issue.
So we wanted it to be in Darja, but then we figured out that this is actually not a desired thing because they are reading it. So, and when they are not being asked by an enumerator about the of the questions. So, and when they read something, we were advised by our survey company, by our implementing partner Elka, that it makes more sense for people to read Fusha rather than Darja. So therefore, we had 3 full days of transforming all questions into Fusha here on that very table. So with a translator. So
and we also got the feedback that
yeah, from the pilot as well. Yeah. So we did a small pilot in Beni Khaled and in Megreen, and we were told that this doesn't work. When we read, we wanna read in Fusha, and then we never received a complaint from the actual respondents. And while I was doing the field research, while I was doing the interviews with party officials, I had the chance to talk to the enumerators in different parts of the country, and I asked particularly about that, but nobody complained about it being Fusha. Because, and these are, I mean, as you saw, they are, like, the level of education is so high. These people want to read, when they read, they want to read Fusha. So, and people who cannot read, which are, I guess, like four people in the whole sample, the questions were read to them by the enumerators. So it was a more classical way of doing the survey. I guess, okay.
So, congratulations, and thank you very much for this presentation and for this work. I wanted to know if similar polls have been conducted in new democracies organizing their first local elections, and if so, how could you compare Tunisia with these countries?
As far as I know, no, that was not the case in other new democracies. There was no local election candidate survey in other democracies, in other new democracies. There is a new paper which talks about how the first local democratic elections affect the party building in Mozambique. I was talking about this to my housemate, and when I told him there's like some of the inspiration I garner is from a Mozambique paper, he was just like, what? But I think this is still very important because the paper is very well showing that this basically how this tension between seeking for loyalty and competence is happening within parties, especially the main dominant party, or the party which thinks itself as the dominant party, is trying to find the loyal candidates, and the party which is trying to become a better competitor, let's say, is trying to find more competent candidates. And I think this had some reflections in Tunisia too, based on my modest observations in the field, which also expect to be analyzed more closely. So yeah, the effects of decentralization were analyzed in the political science and economics disciplines, more about their effects on the public policy provision, the quality of public policies, the quality of public goods and services. How it affected the political game is kind of a new area of research, although this shouldn't have been the case, but c'est la vie, I guess. So I think we will be able to contribute with our findings in this research to that to that academic debate too, like how parties respond to this challenge of finding so many candidates, running so many different campaigns at the same time, coordinating between them. There was a huge problem of coordination for horizontal parity. Like half of your lists should be headed by women and half of your lists should be headed by men. How are you going to do this? How are you going to make sure that half of them are headed by women, and all different local organizations are preparing the list? So this was a huge coordination problem for parties as well, and alliances, Ittihad Medeni and Cephe Şabiye. So these are all like very relevant questions to this research.
Thank you, Aytug, for your presentation.
Thank you.
So I was going to ask you a question about because I didn't remember whether there was a statistically significant difference between the younger and the older generation secularism, and then I'll look up, and then there's the slide over there.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you have an explanation for this statistical difference? Did you consider the generational change?
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
I don't know the reason though. I mean, so this definitely requires more thinking and much deeper analysis before saying anything. The difference doesn't seem to be huge. So the difference is statistically significant, but I don't know whether it is substantially significant. So therefore, I would actually be reserved in saying something about this yet.
What was the question again for that?
3 different statements about political secularism. The government and parliament should enact laws in accordance with Islamic law. It is better when religious people hold public office in the state. Religious practice is a private matter and should be separated from political life.
Which word did you use for Islamic law? Sharia or
Sharia.
Sharia.
In terms of what?
In terms of those who decide to be candidates, actually, on purpose, they go to defend this ideology.
That
so
might be the case.
Yeah, bias in terms of,
yeah.
It's not representative of the average Tunisian.
Of course, it is representative of the candidates. It's not representative of the Tunisian youth, of course.
Same for gender.
Same for gender, yeah. Yeah, but this is the claim that we are making. So this is representative of what? I don't hear you. Hizb Tahrir didn't run.
Did you include
Tahrir didn't run.
Yeah.
Didn't run for local
So
elections.
Only for parties and independent who run for municipal elections.
This is a survey of local election candidates. What? Hizb Tahrir? They might be. I don't know.
Talking about young democracies, you have a very young one neighboring. Libya actually just hosted a couple of elections, and the news is municipal councils are expiring this year.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're brave enough, you can go and...
If you can find the brave enough companies, why not? Yeah.
You do regular research there, but by the way, your partner does research there as well.
Yeah, so that would be great. I mean, I would be very much looking forward to doing this in other countries as well, and I'm sure Julia would be as well. Like Morocco might be very interesting in terms of like the local elections. Lebanon might be very interesting. Turkey might be quite comparable. Although I mean, Turkey has been having local elections since 60s, as far as I know. So, but still, it would be very interesting to observe how the parties are recruiting their candidates for the local elections. So,
yeah, and you'll find NDI, IRI research on the 2012 election, but that was not national. That was national. For the local elections in Libya, the problem is that each municipal council hosts elections at a separate time, and this will be the case this year and early next year. So it's not a nationwide, which
that might be also very interesting.
You know, a very different problem to handle.
Thank you very much for the questions and everything. I just wanna, since this is my last evening in Tunisia for this visit, I just want to thank so many people, and I want to begin with Sihem Lamine, the coordinator of the Harvard office in Tunisia. A tremendous help, both psychological sometimes, if I may say so, because doing field research is difficult, and people who do it might approve with this. My wonderful collaborators, Julia and Alex, and Iqbal, Elumi, and for the whole team of Alka, and also everybody who basically talked to me and talked to us, because we know this is like a very sensitive information, and we will do our definitely best to make good use of it for the country as well, for the future of the country as well, and also for being here. It was really, really great to share this with you. Thank you.
Now you call for the the article, and then the book, and then we'll have a book launch here.
You will wait a little bit for it.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your warm welcome. There is a small drink, so please have your
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you very much.